So my name is Nathaniel Gonzalez Siemens with the Rodale Institute. I'm on the consulting team. I have just to preface this whole thing, I have a cold today, so I'm going to be hopefully kind of taking this a little bit slow and cutting it a little bit short, but I've changed up my presentation to accommodate a lot more questions. So I'm just going to be, the screen that I'm sharing right now has the title of the webinar and just some notes that I kind of consolidated. So I'm looking forward to getting everyone's interactive questions as much as those are possible. We have a really diverse group here, so I would love to see what people think about some of these topics. So the Rodale Institute has been around for 75 years. We are based out of Pennsylvania, where we started off doing soil research and helping to initiate the organic movement, and now these days are pushing forward with the regenerative organic movement. We've been leaders in that space for many generations now. Lots of people, even out here on the West Coast, still know us from the little green organic gardening books. So it's an exciting space to be in. As I mentioned, I'm on the West Coast. I'm based in California here, in the Central Valley of California specifically. I'm a farmer myself. Before I came to Rodale Institute, I farm almonds and heritage grains. Sometimes we've done cotton. We've done other field crops. So that's my background. I came here about 3 years ago now when Rodale opened up the California Organic Center. So down in Ventura, which is about an hour north of Los Angeles. The California Organic Center, which is run by our research director there, Ariana Bozzolo, started off looking at some different varieties of hemp and how that could be integrated into cropping systems with the farmers who in that region who were very excited about at the time. There was some legislation passed nationally and at state level that opened up that industry. Since then, we've pivoted to a whole variety of trials out there. If you get the chance to visit Southern California, you'd be welcome to come by. We have lots of fun, interactive, experimental trials out there at this point. I'm going to be, like I mentioned it right at the beginning, I've got a cold, so I'm going to be kind of sipping on this thing for most of the webinar. So that was started about 3 years ago that we opened up the California Organic Center. Regional resource centers are located across the country now, so you can find a Rodale Regional Resource Center in most areas, kind of broad regions. So the California Center kind of serves the Southwest and the Pacific region, generally speaking. The other Pacific region service that we offer is through the consulting team, which I'm a part of. I consult the entire West Coast and help out if there's any other tree crops. We each have, there's about a dozen of us on the consulting team, and our job is to translate the research from the scientists into practical applications for farmers, and to also just kind of move the organic movement at kind of a boots on the ground level, move that forward. So we have partnerships with a wide variety of organizations that support farmers. So that's our consulting program. If you know farmers who need help with organic certification or regenerative organic certification, certainly pass them our way. We're always looking for new connections and always happy to help people out. So my context is obviously very Mediterranean. I also cover Oregon and Washington, and actually up into Alaska. So that that context is unified by the climate of a much cooler, wetter winter, not much below freezing though, and a much warmer, drier summer, although there still is some summer precipitation even in some of the driest parts, very occasional summer precipitation. We had flooding in Death Valley this year, so there you go. So that's where my experience comes from. That's what I'll be kind of talking to these questions, to the points at. So that's all kind of background. The title of this was Holistic Considerations of Water Utilization in Organic and Regenerative Farming Systems. And where I'm coming from is that my own farm, our well went dry 2 years ago now. And many farmers in this area have had wells with decreased productivity or entirely dried out. Obviously, we've been in the middle of a drought for, I don't know, time immemorial, but certainly for the last 3 years, we've been in a very serious drought here in California and the West Coast. So that's obviously the immediate concern that we have. How do we farm organically, given that reality, that may be a new reality or a permanent reality? I'd love to, if people want to post in the question part, if you have some, if you're in California, certainly, and you want to mention some aspects of your water situation, or if you're outside of California and have analogous or a very different situation, I'd love to see this posted in the Q&A so we can kind of start to build a more holistic picture of what we're facing. So the way that I've been conceiving of this problem, of our issue, our kind of our water issue, is what are our resources and how are we utilizing them? And then we'll layer organic onto that as a kind of a theoretical structure and also a legal structure as well. So because organic has both of those aspects. So for the sources, we have here in California, here at my farm, we've got surface water for irrigation. So water that's pulled largely off of reservoirs in the Sierra Nevada mountains. We have groundwater for irrigation. So that was my well that went dry and I'm no longer utilizing. But our very common out here in the West is pulling water out of wells. Subsurface flow, which is not common right where I'm at, but in many other areas of especially the kind of basin and ranges, areas like Eastern California and throughout Nevada, Idaho, and a lot of kind of what we think of the mountainous West. And there's young alluvial soils. There tends to be subsurface flow underneath those that's important in an agricultural context, especially for hays and dryland grains, things like that. Obviously, there's rainfall and snow that are an important part of water sources, and this is one that we'll kind of be touching on. We'll be touching on all of these, I think. And the last one is flooding and riparian, which is obviously not modernly thought of as an irrigation source, but it certainly is a water source, and it's probably most significant in my region in a historical context. So where I'm standing right now is adjacent to a large historical lake, and there was I wouldn't call it a seasonal lake, but it was an unstable lake, not a permanent lake. So it would get washed out occasionally every 100 years, say, to get taller and lower. And the riparian areas as well were very ubiquitous because all of that snow melt coming off of our local mountains would come down the valley floor and be utilized by crops in that system. So I think this is going to be an important consideration, especially when we start thinking of regenerative water cycling, hydrologic cycling. I'm going to read people's questions right now. Okay. Located in southern Idaho, we're in a fairly rough drought ourselves. Very little snowfall the past 2 winters, and next to no rain in the summers. It's been incredibly negative impact on yields, particularly dryland farms, and productivity of pasture land has increased the price of hay significantly. Okay, thank you for sharing that. That was Lee, and then Kurt, sorry, is in Missouri. Says 100% of Missouri is in drought right now. Me and 40% of our state are in a severe or worse drought. So thanks both of you for sharing. If I am missing anything here, like I said, I'm a little bit fuzzy right now on all of my faculties. So if I'm missing anything, you think about other things that, or you want to comment on some of the things I've mentioned, just throw it right in the Q&A. I can read it out and we can respond to it, and we'll just move forward that way. So, okay, water uses. So these are all the ways that water are coming to, at least in my context, the ones that I'm most familiar with. Certainly, if you have some other ones, throw those in the Q&A, and we can mention those as well. And then water uses. So once again, this is just kind of basic information, but I think it's good for all of us that are kind of down the rabbit hole to kind of take these big picture perspectives, and also for there's probably some people on this chat who this might be new information as well. But obviously, the first and most important water use for the purpose of this chat is crops and pasture lands. So we're irrigating, or we're putting that water, or the water is going onto crops and pasture lands to raise crops. A rangeland is never irrigated. That's kind of the definitional difference between a pasture land and rangelands. One's irrigated and one's not, at least by my definitions. And then surface water body functions. So I thought about labeling this as ecosystem functions, but things like salmon populations would be an important one here in California. Riparian species along water bodies, lake health and size. Those I think would all fall into water body functions or ecosystem functions as it relates to the quote unquote normal flow of water across the surface. Non-agricultural human uses like municipal and industrial use, those are obviously highly impactful to not just crops, but also to natural systems. Aquifer recharge, which is where I'm going to hopefully spend more of my time talking about. And then atmospheric water cycling, which I'm not very familiar with, but I know it's been a popular conversation piece. So certainly if you have some thoughts about that part F, I would welcome those in the Q&A. All right. Organic and regenerative considerations. So a couple of definitions here, and these are actually not as Byzantine as they might appear. And I think I'm gonna have to move over my Q&A thing so I can read this. I just expanded my Q&A thing. Okay, here we go. The farmer must maintain or improve the natural resources of the operation, including soil and water quality. This is NOP standard 2205-200. So this has been a largely unenforced component of the organic standards, but anything that is sold as organic, this is the first kind of like opening stanza of the organic standards, and this is what they're aiming for. This is what, when it was written, this is the nation of the people, by the people, for the people. This is it. This is kind of the first and most important standard to meet as an organic farmer, but it's been largely unregulated regulated. You know, we know that pesticides are heavily regulated with organic, but in terms of soil quality and water quality, those have been largely secondary. That's changing, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. In fact, it's even in the definitions component when they talk about natural resources. Hydraulic systems are named as such. So we know that there's legislation, there's a legally kind of binding contract between the farmer and the USDA's upholding of that verbiage of the sticker, of that certification sticker, and it talks about water quality and hydrologic processes. So what does that mean in real terms, in real tangible pragmatic terms? That means number one, issues of concern, chemical leaching, and this has been by far the most addressed and kind of well understood component of water quality of hydraulic processes, is that if you put something you spray something on a field, you dump something on a field, that will enter into the water system, either surface water or into the aquifer. At any rate, it won't go away. Just because you put it on your field doesn't mean that's the only place it's going. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that, although the salinity important thing is super critical where I'm at. And nitrogen, not so much. I know that's important in other parts of the country. Let me jump back in. Q&A. Okay. Allison says, I live in Iowa and we added a new category, exceptional drought, which is higher than severe drought to describe conditions this year. This is kind of getting euphemistic at this point. So I guess we can laugh about it. It's still a graveyard humor at this point. So yeah, we weren't laughing the day our well went out. It was, well, not just the day, it was the month afterwards, and we were hauling in water for it was fortunately well, not fortunately, but it was a domestic well. It wasn't our ag well. We don't have an ag well. We just are off of surface water for the ag. But yeah, that once we started hauling in water for our kind of household use, that's when it got real for us. That's when, you know, severe, exceptional, like all of that went out the window, and this is how we're living. Like every single drop counts. Like kids, you're taking that bucket to the bathroom, and I want to only see half of that used this time because I'm not anxious to go fill up another tote of water. So anyway, thank you, Allison, for sharing. Okay, so chemical leaching, we're really familiar with that. There's a lot of science. We have a good understanding of it. There's recommendations. The organic systems are as a consultant, organic systems are well understood, and we can consult directly to that component. There's a lot of recommendations from extension services, from research and universities that speak to the chemical leaching. Aquifer recharge, though, is probably a much less talked about component, but out here in the West, it's becoming a very real concern because our aquifers are getting depleted, and I know in the Midwest the same thing is true, but it's entering into the public discourse much more because of the SGMA legislation. There's a groundwater management legislation that was passed by the California legislature 10 years ago now, maybe. Someone can correct me on that on Q&A if you want to add that in there. But the SGMA legislation is requiring aquifers and specifically regions that have their own aquifer to have a plan of how to maintain the level of that water. So the idea is that there's going to be a lot more regimented measurements of what water's coming out of the ground, how water's going back into the ground and into the aquifer specifically, and how that is how the government can or let's say government, I don't want to get too political here, how everyone involved can understand that process and be more vested in that process. So as it relates to organics, anything that we can do to leverage our practices towards aquifer recharge is going to be a positive for that issue of concern. Second one, or the third one, sorry, is shallow water cycling. And I separated that out from aquifer recharge because around here aquifers are deep. I mean, they're hundreds, if not thousands of feet deep, and water, they may not even have real access to those. There may be no percolation route down to those real deepest ones, but there's certainly, whichever one they are settling at, whatever aquifer is getting recharged, those are going to be not just on the surface. It's not going to be something that a plant's roots would reach to. So a shallow water cycle, maybe a good definition of that in my mind is root accessible. So the shallow water cycling system is probably where most of the attention is being paid on in a regenerative sense and organic sense as well. What are the processes that a farmer is implementing that would increase or create a healthier water cycling system at the depth of the root zone. So around here, that could be maybe up to 50 feet if you're talking about perennial systems like a vineyard, but more likely we're just talking a few inches or a foot or two. Okay, organic advantages. So the organic advantages, the easiest one, and the most, I'm not going to say simplest because it's actually really, really complicated. And most of our consulting time is spent talking about this one. But first one is mulch. Creating a physical barrier at the top of the soil that decreases soil temperature, increases humidity, or creates an effective buffer between the drier air above the mulch and higher moisture level below the mulch. And also restricts weeds or other capillary functionality in the soil too. So so mulches, or organic systems are well known, especially garden systems are well known for having mulch as a critical component. And as a consultant, a lot of my time is spent helping farmers to figure out how they can agronomically apply mulch. And most of the time that's in the form of a terminated cover crop. Obviously, there's some situations that aren't too rare out here, actually, where people are physically applying a straw to their vineyards, usually, once again. But most of what we're talking about would be cover crops. And the considerations there are what can you grow that will terminate readily so that it doesn't reseed itself and create a problem with competition with your cash crop, which I'm sure that there's some good resources already in Rodale's archive about how that can be achieved in the Midwest. I'm pretty sure that we don't have good archives for those on the West Coast, since I probably would have been the one who would have had to do them. So maybe that'll be one of my next webinars, is cover cropping and termination on the West and Pacific and Mountain West, maybe. All right, so any questions? Feel free to jump right in. All right. Next, organic advantage or common organic practice would be increased soil health. Is probably how I should have just labeled that. But specifically, what I was thinking of that is biological function. So maybe I could even break that down. But the idea is that a healthier soil, just the dirt, healthy dirt is going to have better shallow water cycling in the form of water retention and the form of water availability. And it's kind of saving the best for last. This really is the kind of the last point that I want to talk about. But this is also by far the most poorly understood aspect of all of this water cycling system, and probably all of modern agriculture right now, is soil health. So I'm just going to say that with the caveat of kind of starting off the discussion about this is that I don't really know what I'm talking about here. And if someone does tell you they know what they're talking about, like, be very skeptical. So, all right, before I start telling you what I don't know about, I had another question coming in. How are cover crops usually being terminated? It's a great question. Rodale is famous for the roller crimper that our founder, Jeff Moyer, helped design and popularize. Roller crimpers are just an absolutely ingenious and intuitively simple device that lays down a cover crop and uses a vertical bar to not chop but crimp and hopefully break the cellular flow through the stem of whatever you're laying down. And it works really well because it looks like it's going to work well, and it does work well, but the utilization of those has been a fairly narrow. It's been hard for people to get very broad and general application of it or efficacy of it. That said, we are still doing a lot of experiments with them, and they've been almost not utilized at all. They don't exist on the West Coast. So that's, if you get the chance to visit the California Organic Center, you can see one that we have there that we got shipped out from Pennsylvania, and some of the experiments that Dr. Bozzolo's doing to see if she can figure out how to utilize those in kind of our context and in our cropping system. Honestly, on my own farm, I just use a flail mower, so I just cut it, and that works well too. It has some advantages and some disadvantages too. It's more you're putting in more cost and more energy, and you have more kind of things that can break in it as opposed to a roller crimper. But it has the advantage of being very certain in your termination, because you're literally cutting a plant down to the ground. And it also has some breakdown aspects, some kind of an more even bed prep capacity, which is important if you're replanting or reseeding something. Thanks for your question. Okay, increased soil health. So the ones that I listed here. Oh, never mind. So there's some note. Actually, there is one note. Sorry. Oh, thank you, Justin, for sharing the roller crimper blueprints. So yeah, go make your own. Go buy some steel and make a roller crimper. I think it's bending the cutter, the crimping shanks. It's the tricky part, but it can be done. We've got some people here in California who are making it. Okay. So I'm going to rattle off the kind of the stuff that I have dangerous knowledge about for increasing soil health. So water, we know that water functions differently in different soil types, sand versus clay versus sandy loam, blah, blah, blah. But we also know that the water functions very differently when there's a functional soil ecosystem there, and not just a soil ecosystem, but also a commensurate plant ecosystem as well. So when, if we walk out into a forest or onto a grassland, probably more appropriately, we would see and we would know almost intuitively that there's very different things going on in the soil than in just a bare dirt, which is what you would see in a very conventional, heavily tilled cropland. So what we're seeing there, kind of what we know intuitively, that that soft, squishy feel of walking on the sod, the assumption that it's holding water well and that that's going to stay moist like a sponge. What we're seeing there is soil aggregates, soil organic matter, and the roots and microbes that are actually alive in the soil, kind of functioning in that soil profile. And I'm going to try to go over each one of these individually. So soil aggregates are enormously complex and just enormously big molecules that are all kind of stuck together and have water holding capacity inside it. It's almost literally a sponge. It's just a organ of the soil, or I have some better way of putting that, a functional component of the soil that could hold water. So that's kind of how we're thinking of it in these terms. Soil organic matter, or soil organic carbon, is a molecule, carbon, that may be associated with any number of kind of larger structures, but they have the capacity to bond to water independently. So it could be related to soil. These are all related to each other, but in this sense, we're just thinking of soil organic matter as an individual molecule that can bond to water. And then root and microbial metabolism. So roots and microbes are, they're living, breathing organisms. So they're breathing the same as we are. They're breathing in and out water. They're also using that to uptake, especially roots are using the water to uptake minerals. So they're feeding with water. So we know that this complex web of functions is mitigating how water travels through the soil. And depending on who you ask, in reality, that functionality is obviously very complex, but there's kind of pros and cons to it in an agricultural sense. There's a reason why people cut down orchards in order to plant crops. And there's also, on the reverse side of that, there's a reason why permaculture is advocating to replant orchards in order to plant crops. And it basically, though, is it would come down to these components right here. Once again, anyone feel free to jump in with questions or comments as you want to. So the application of this to shallow water cycling and to aquifer recharge is how much of that water is available to plants, to crops, and two, how much of it is cycling through and going downward. So as you can imagine, it's much more simple to imagine the system with a limited number of variables. Temperature, solar exposure, water bonding and adherence to soil molecules, as opposed to the almost infinite amount of variables that just these four components that I just introduced here are. And I'm sure there's many other families of components that can be talked about as well. But the upshot is that we know that there are functional agriculture or modern agriculture is operating at very minimal with very minimal assistance from biological pathways. And generally speaking, especially the regenerative organic movement, but also more and more the organic movement, are trying to see how much we can integrate these pathways or these functions of the soil into an organic system. And that's a lot of what the research that our scientists are working on, and extension scientists and that on-farm trials are working on, is figuring out, how what's the measurement, what's the correspondence relationship between soil organic matter and germination rate, and how does the water moisture play within that bell curve. So all right. A question here from Mariella. What types of mulch are you testing with growers? Oh man, nationwide, I wouldn't be able to. You can shoot me an email. I can get you a very thorough answer to that. Here in California, and the farms that I'm personally working with, we've got sorghum Sudan grass, which is a fast-growing, very, very tall, high biomass grass that we've worked on. We've done cover crop blends, kind of with different different components. The ones that we most recently worked on was a legume heavy blend out here. The most successful have been rye, and that is across the country. Rye has been the most successful, and the reason for that is it has a very narrow anthesis period, so a narrow flowering period. So you have to terminate your cover crop before it forms seeds, before the seeds are viable in the seed head. And if you have a grass, that's a lot easier than if you have a legume or any other plant that's indeterminate viability or maturation. So in other words, grasses, the seeds all get mature at the same time, and you terminate them just before that. Whereas the legumes and other many other plants have indeterminate, so that they have some mature seeds, some immature seeds. So you can't really terminate it at a single point. I mean, you have to terminate at a single point, but there's almost inevitably it's going to be either too early and you don't have enough biomass, or it's going to be too late and you have some viable seeds in there. Good question. Thanks, Marielle. All right. I'm going to jump into the future considerations part here. I feel like I didn't really do a great job of talking about soil health, even though that's really our calling card. It's definitely something that I'm excited to learn more about, and would love to talk to with any of you and hear what your observations are on that, your experience with the kind of your local context is with those components, because that's really where the rubber meets the road, is at least in kind of in my spheres. Is that soil health and how that affects the aquifer and shallow water cycling. So the future considerations is earlier today in this webinar, I mentioned the organic standards, and that the foundational standard is talking about natural resource improvement or conservation, and I said that wasn't heavily enforced, and that as long as you're have some reasonable irrigation plan, you're not just like dumping water off onto the road, no one's going to really care what you're doing. That I see that changing, not just, or I see the potential for that to change in the near future, not just because of SGMA legislation here, or the obvious fact that farmers everywhere are trying to conserve water, but I see it changing, and I see the possibility for it to be very scientifically informed because of tillage, or because of the analog that we're seeing in tillage. So 10 years ago, 15 years ago, tillage, you know, tillage is also a natural resource. You know, tillage relates to erosion, Dust Bowl, that happened. So, but you know, Dust Bowl was apparently forgotten as a significant component of kind of how we farm, because in up until about 10 years ago, or maybe even less, probably 5 years ago, maybe even right now, realistically, that tillage component wasn't regulated within the natural resources language of that standard. So you could till your land as much as you wanted, really, and still get organic certification. Certainly, if you had massive erosion problems that for some reason as a farmer you didn't care about, like maybe your certifying body would write you a non-compliance or question that. But generally speaking, it wasn't something that was heavily regulated. Now, though, and there's probably a lot of different reasons for this, but nowadays that's not the case. Nowadays, tillage is on the front of everyone's mind. There's a lot of conversation about it within regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of conversations about it in popular media, and there's a broad understanding within the public and with farmers that tillage is bad for soil health, obviously bad for erosion, and probably bad for water cycling as well. So, but that's just an analog. The reason I'm using that as an analog is because I think that we can see now with an increased consumer understanding of many aspects of farming, but most especially soil health, we can see that has the capacity to change the way that the USDA understands these standards, and USDA is now expanding the capacity of certifiers to enforce that part of the tillage part. And I would expect, and don't hold me to this, but I would expect in the next, 5 or 10 years to see a lot more USDA interest and regenerative organic certification interest in water cycling and hydraulic processes as a component of the natural resources standard. In other words, in order to get organic certified, you have to take care of your water. So that's my expectation. I haven't seen any of that like on the ground particularly, but I really do think that that's coming, just kind of given the status of Sigma out here and the kind of increased appreciation of the effects of climate change and just general awareness of soil health. All right, 11:45. My voice is almost shot, and I will take some more questions if you got them. Okay. Kurt, what about swales to recharge? Does size matter? Are there studies showing they actually work? That's a great question. Swales is really the, kind of at the heart and center of permaculture. So I don't know of broadacre systems. I've heard of broadacre systems of kind of like large farms or production farms. Let's put it that way. Conventional style farming that utilizes swales. Although my orchard is flood irrigated, and in a sense, it's terracing and swales are very, very similar ideas. And the terracing that we have here, which is very subtle, like most people walking through, anyone walking through, I walk through and can't tell the differences. I can't tell that it's terraced or swaled, but effectively that it is. There's so that the water can move across our fields in an organized manner. They're effectively swaled, or at least terraced. So those systems have been used for a long time. They're certainly effective, and they can be used at broad acreage. But the word swales and how that relates to recharge is largely kind of in the domain of permaculture. So I would suggest looking at that information, and I will make a note to look into that myself, because it's definitely an interesting aspect. And if you want to email me after this, I'll be happy to converse with you about that. All right, next question. How are the certifying agencies assessing tillage? What is allowed? So that's a really good question. There's, as you probably, most consumers know, the organic NOP standards are very specifically written. It's rare that you would find one with ambiguity, but this is probably one that there's ambiguity, that there's fairly minimal guidance that's been published by the USDA to help certifying bodies to decide whether a farmer is in compliance or not. So I expect to see some more of that coming out soon. Sorry, more guidance around that. Generally, though, it's a little bit hard to, it's not a little bit, it's a lot hard to regulate or assess tillage. As you can all imagine, there's a wide range of depths of tillage, of type of tillage implements. A no-till drill are very common these days, but there's dozens of different kinds of no-till drills too. So no, there's not that assessment. I think right now would best be described as, is there a reasonable plan out there? The ROC certification, regenerative organic certification, kind of leans into that reasonableness. You can only be using tillage to get regenerative organic certified. You can only be using tillage for the normal components of planting and harvesting and eliminating weeds. And if you want to get higher levels of ROC certification, regenerative organic certification, they have different standard levels, different tiers. Then you'll need to reduce those to the point of a gold standard. You really can't have any tillage at all. So it's complicated, and hopefully we'll be getting, there's a lot of research around it, and hopefully we'll be getting more information or more guidance from land-grant universities and Rodale's own scientists, and that USDA will be implementing and helping certifiers to kind of have more specific language around that. Thanks for that question. Next question. How do you think certifying bodies could regulate water usage? What would they look for? That's a great question. I haven't thought about that until just reading that right now. But obviously there's a lot of monitoring technology right now that is being utilized at state and regional levels to find out where water's going. Satellite imagery is used to calculate the evapotranspiration rate. Obviously, there's soil probes that can also inform that information. It's more difficult to see what water is going downward, than to see it going upward, which is maybe a little bit non-intuitive. That it would seem like in the air it's this very ephemeral spot, and water goes up in the air and it's gone. But there's some pretty smart, creative technology for that besides just the satellite imagery. But water going downwards is fairly difficult to track and figure out where it's at in the strata. In terms of the regulation components, I would suspect right now there's no language around water usage in any of the organic or regenerative standards that I've come across, but that there is a lot of language around cover cropping and ground cover and crop rotation too. Crop rotation is very heavily kind of standardized, but all of those components relate directly to groundwater, to water usage, and it's not inconceivable that a groundwater usage could be incentivized. And this is back to a component that I didn't talk about much, but the flooding and riparian water sourcing or natural water flow. So we kind of have an intuitive idea that, you know, if you are harvesting something in an area that's naturally flooded, like rice, for example, like that's a good use of water, even though there's tons and tons of water out there. And so I think that if there's some way of tying the standards for the crops that are getting produced and the crop rotation, especially in terms of cover crop, and leveraging that to describe how aquifer recharge and how water utilization is being regulated, that might be a more effective route. That's definitely an area that I would like to think about more though. So once again, feel free to email. Next question, can you speak a bit more about your flood irrigation system? Is this an efficient use of water when water is scarce? That is an awesome question. It was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, definitely 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was a really inefficient system, not because it's any different than it is today, but because it was very, our understanding and priorities and kind of like kind of social awareness were in a very different place than they are today. Today, it's considered a very efficient system, largely because we can plant cover crops here, whereas you can't plant those with and we can also recharge the aquifer, which you can't get cover crops and you can't get aquifer recharge if you're using a micro sprinkler or a drip system, at least not in any reasonable sense. I don't think anyone would try to do aquifer recharge with those. So people are putting back in flood irrigation systems around here, and that relates back to the water sourcing. So originally this area, like I said before, was an oak savanna, and that savanna and the how the water kind of moved across the land here was through seasonal flooding and seasonal creeks. So in a sense, this flood irrigated orchard is kind of mimicking that type of a that type of a system. So it's flooding the orchard. Granted, we're doing it in the summer, not in the winter, and the around here most of our floods and our seasonality would be in the early spring, so December through, I don't know, June, July, something like that. So I think that for us, for my orchard, what we're aiming for is something like that. And that there's a lot of considerations that go into that. Obviously, I'm sure you can imagine that, how the water is getting out into the orchard, when it's getting out into the orchard, are very reliant on the systems that we have, but also what kind of plants we have. So almonds were bred away from summer dormancy. So now they have to have water in the summer. They didn't used to, but almonds are a Mediterranean crop that doesn't, that's used to having dry summers and can produce, fruit that happily produces fruit, even with very, very dry summers, bone dry summers. So a lot of these questions are system level questions that would, and we're our consultancy works with not just farmers, but also seed breeders, heritage seed banks, things like that, to re-equip a farmer to actually plant things that are appropriate for our region, which I didn't talk about on here at all, which is probably almost more critical than any of this stuff. So great question though. It's a pretty big tangent that I ran on there. I think that's all the questions. It is 11:57. We've got 3 minutes left. I definitely appreciated everyone's questions as they came up. Thank you all for attending. You can definitely contact me if you have any further questions, or if you are interested in consulting help, or if you just want to brainstorm if there's some partnership that Rodale can engage in with you wherever you're at. Like I said, I'm on the West Coast, but we have people all across the country, and some people in other parts of the world too. So thanks for coming, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. I'm gonna go grab some lunch and stop talking.